Hi again, everybody. Welcome back for Vertical 4. This time we are looking at culture and society. So, if you're looking across here, this puts us exactly at halfway done with the vertical review videos, which we will try to complete this week. So, Vertical 4, culture and society. As we look at the very beginning, as we're defining kind of an American culture and American society, in that very first period from 1492 to 1607, we've got a blending of cultures, right? You've got especially in the French and the Spanish regions, you have a blending of the European culture and the indigenous American continent culture. And, nobody did this better than the French and the Spanish. The English really did a terrible job of trying to blend the cultures, but when they really get here in force in 1607, but the French made an attempt, the Spanish made an attempt, and we can look at those attempts and say, well, were they spurred on by something great in them there where they're coming over going, oh, let's see what these people have to offer, or was it brought by necessity? I think we all know what the answer was, but they were certainly far more successful at blending cultures than the English would be later. Exploration was driven by religion, right? Part of the reason that the Spaniards are sending people over is religion, and that's certainly what you're using to motivate the guys who are lower on the socioeconomic totem pole. And the same thing with the French. They're sending missionaries over with the explorers. When we get to period two, from Jamestown to the French and Indian War, we start talking about the two main regions, right? We've got the Southern culture that's developing in Virginia colony. We've got the New England culture that's developing up around Massachusetts. In New England, as we said a million times, this entire colony is based on the Puritan religion. It's based on religious ideas. That's an inherently cultural thing. And in the South, it's not inspired by religion in the least, but it is reflecting this culture of a racial caste system, which did not exist in England and is being created by these English folks here in the United States. First Great Awakening is taking place at the very end of this period. And remember, it's the revivals. Church and faith are becoming something that is supposed to be more exciting, that is supposed to be more democratic, where people are making decisions within their churches instead of the decisions coming from the top down. And there's an excitement and a fervor about it. And that's very different than what's come before for many of the Europeans. And it's something that's going to influence the way they look at the American Revolution. So we get to that revolutionary period when we go from the French and Indian War through to 1800. The influence of Enlightenment thought. The Enlightenment is a cultural intellectual movement focusing on applying rationality to society, culture, and government the same way it's been applied to science and the scientific revolution. Enlightenment thought is going to have a huge influence on the revolution. Things like natural rights, separation of powers, the social contract. That's what these guys are thinking about when they're putting together the structures of the American Constitution. Women, the role of women, they have a role in the revolution, but they're not considered citizens. We've got Abigail Adams, who is absolutely John Adams's conscience, and she's easily as important as half of the people that we talk about in the American Revolution, playing a huge role, an intellectual role, but still not considered a citizen. We move on from that to that period from 1800 on, where we have the first peaceful transfer of power, and we get that Second Great Awakening. We get this next big religious movement. Remember, we said this one's critical because in the Second Great Awakening, they're starting to talk about the things I do on earth are important to my salvation in the view of my religion. So these folks are really going to focus on these reform movements. We talked about slavery abolition. The Second Great Awakening is a huge prod towards the abolition movement, the temperance movement to make alcohol illegal, women's rights and women's suffrage, which the Seneca Falls Declaration is going to come out at the very end of this period, prison reforms. All of these things are going to come out of the Second Great Awakening. And then there's this cult of domesticity for women. Cult of domesticity being the idea that Women are supposed to run the household, and they're supposed to do all of the quote unquote soft work, which is not soft at all and is backbreaking work. But they're supposed to be submissive in the house, doing the household things, and not worrying themselves with the world outside. In some ways, we look at this as a reduction of the role of women from what it had been in the colonial and revolutionary periods. Um, into the period around the Civil War, we start seeing from religion and from culture the defenses of slavery and militant abolition coming from the Bible. And again, we talked about this in the horizontal video. Um, this is a big change, right? When we look at the Second Great Awakening and the idea that people believe the Lord is calling them to work to end slavery, now the slavery people are like, "Now wait a minute, man. I can find a part of the Bible that says slavery's good too." And now you've got these ideological defenses of slavery rooted exceedingly loosely in the Bible, and militant abolitionism like John Brown, where they're like, well, it's okay for us to go kill people in their sleep as long as we're ending slavery. And kind of these radical things happening on both sides. Millennial religious movements. You see at the end of this, the idea that the world's coming to an end. We're going to, kind of the gloom and doom forecasters saying we need to prepare for the end of the world, and this has a matter of urgency. We also have the beginning of nativism when we're looking at American culture, and that's something that starts in this period, hasn't gone away yet. This hatred of immigrants, the idea that immigrants are bringing disease, stealing jobs, responsible for crime, that is not something new to today. That is something that goes back a very, very long time. When we get to the period of the Gilded Age, social Darwinism is really the cultural touchstone that we look for. It's this pseudoscientific route that some people are better than others, that there are really, if we're thinking of science, they're kind of making the argument that there are different subspecies of humans, and some of those are better and smarter than others. Some people are inherently better than others due to evolution. And so science is being applied to really the racism that had existed before and the classism that existed before, and trying to use science to explain it. And as we said, that's going to have dramatic consequences through to the present day. Social Darwinism, if that's what a lot of people are kind of starting to believe in, then we're not going to be real surprised when the backlash to minorities and immigrants happens when we get to the 1920s after the First World War. We shouldn't be shocked a bit that this social Darwinism of the 1880s and 90s is going to come roaring back in the roaring 20s. Remember, in the aftermath of World War I, people are suspicious that every immigrant is going to bring communism to the United States, that minorities are going to invade the cities because of all of these massive things that we talked about, from the immigration stoppages after World War I to the Great Migration. There's this huge white backlash to minorities and immigrants, and this is the rise of the most dangerous version of the KKK we'd seen in American history. The second KKK is targeting lots and lots of people. They amass enormous power in both the North and the South, and they make racism into something completely acceptable in most of society. And it's one of the most dangerous moments in American history in a lot of ways. We have the flowering of a true American culture in this era. American culture up until this point, there is lots of American culture, don't get me wrong, but lots of the things that are American culture are modifications of European culture. And in this period from the 1890s to the 1920s, we see a real American culture start to develop with the writers of the Lost Generation, with especially jazz music, which so many people say is the one true American art form. All of this stuff really comes of age in this period. Finally, in period 7, we're going into period 8 here, aren't we? Losing track. In period 8, which again you're not going to get tested on, but let's talk about it. we have kind of another, it's not necessarily a great awakening, but another really religious moment in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, you have some of the highest church attendance rates you ever had in American history. Churches are built all over the place. I would urge you, as you drive around Toledo, look at how many churches are built between about 1951 and 1968 in Toledo, Ohio. There's church after church after church after church that's kind of built in the same kind of plans and stuff. And they all kind of look the same, but a lot of churches in Toledo are built in the 50s and 60s. You have the social movements, social backlash movements against the racism and the sexism that's existed with the civil rights movement, women's rights movement. We see an environmental rights movement start at this time. We see protests against the American government by students, some of the larger protests in American history during the Vietnam War. Um, and then after that, when we get to the period from 1980 to the present, um, we have the period of the Vietnam Syndrome. This idea that and it's not just an idea, it's a reality. The Vietnam War kind of fundamentally changed some things in American society. First of all, it breaks the bonds of trust between the American people and their government. Prior to the Vietnam War, people disagreed with their government. They disagreed with certain policies that were carried out by their government, but they believed deeply that the American system was just. They believed that we had a very great form of government, and that was a almost universally held belief. They believed that, sure, there might be individual bad politicians, but the politicians in themselves were not bad. The Vietnam syndrome kind of creates this hyper cynicism. And to be frank, it's an unwarranted cynicism. Not all politicians are bad people, but we have this backlash after Vietnam on both the left and right that all politicians are bad people. And that they all must have ulterior motives and be nasty people trying to make power plays. Um, we have the culture wars starting in the 1980s, where more liberal people are saying we need to have um, increased roles for women. We have the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment happen at this time, but never quite get enough states on board to get the amendment over the edge. We have affirmative action programs trying to equal out the problems of racism that still persist. We had arguments about family structure. You had increasing diversity in the country as more and more people from Asia and Africa come and the Middle East come into the United States. And then you have backlash over that, right? As we've seen every other time in America. And that's kind of where we are right now. If you look throughout all of history, if you look at this whole sweep of American history from the 1400s on, what does it start with? It starts with kind of a blending of cultures. Then it's no, we're going to reject all of that stuff and we're going to create a new England here and we're going to make sure racism is used. Then you have this revolution, which is kind of a swing towards equality. You have these reform movements that are kind of a swing towards equality. Then you get these, defenses of slavery and the nativists, this backlash against the idea of equality. Social Darwinism, a backlash against the idea of equality that continues through the 1920s. Then things start to loosen up in the 50s and 60s, going into the 70s and 80s, and now we're kind of in a swing back against it. So again, it's I hate to overuse a metaphor, but people say it's a pendulum in American history. Things swing wildly one way and wildly the other way, and that's where we are, right? That's where everybody in American history has been at some point on that pendulum swing. So I hope this made some sense to you. This here endeth the lesson, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.